politics and economics at the end of the 20th century. The election of 1968 and the silent majority. The election of 1968 included four major candidates: Robert Kennedy, George Wallace, Richard Nixon, and Hubert Humphrey. Kennedy was assassinated. George Wallace was a third party and was supported by southern states. Richard Nixon was a Republican and former vice president to Eisenhower. Hubert Humphrey was a Democrat, senator from Minnesota, and vice president to Lyndon B. Johnson. It was a close election. Nixon beat Humphrey by 1% with help from the silent majority, which were U.S. citizens who supported Nixon's policies but who were not politically vocal. When Nixon took office, he had to deal with the problems from Vietnam. He believed in Vietnamization, which is where the U.S. would pull troops from Vietnam and only support it financially. He also sent help to clear out Cambodia, where the Vietnamese were launching attacks. The invasion of Cambodia led to nationwide U.S. protests. 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen at Kent State University during a protest in Ohio, which further turned people against the war. The Pentagon Papers showed the American public that the government misled the public into the war. In 1975, the fall of Saigon signaled the end of the war. U.S. casualties were at 50,000, and South Vietnamese casualties were at 400,000. Nixon believed in détente, which is the relaxing of tensions between two nations. In 1972, Nixon traveled to China, and this led to better relations. The U.S. agreed to support China's admission into the UN and to pursue economic and cultural exchanges. In 1972, Democratic headquarters in Washington were broken into and eavesdropping gadgets installed. This led to a scandal that affected the rest of Nixon's presidency.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
When existence of Oval Office tapes were learned, Nixon refused to give them up. This led to the Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon fires prosecutor Archibald Cox. In 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that the tapes had to be turned over. Right before he got impeached, Nixon resigned, allowing Ford to become president. Stagflation is when unemployment and inflation both go up. This led to the energy crisis. By the 1970s, the U.S. imported a third of its oil. On October 6, 1973, the Yom Kippur War began when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel from two sides. The U.S. airlifted supplies to Israel, prompting OPEC to levy an oil embargo against Israel's allies that lasted until March 8, 1974. Gas prices suddenly doubled, and fueling stations frequently ran out of gas. Prices for virtually everything else rose in response to high energy costs, causing record inflation. When Ford took office, he initiated the Whip Inflation Now movement, but American people didn't take it seriously. Ford believed that a balanced federal budget and reductions in government spending were the best ways to curb inflation. To help the economy, Ford vetoed more bills than any other U.S. president. Deindustrialization is a shift away from a manufacturing-based economy. The oil crisis and the falling productivity of U.S. manufacturing led to the decline of several industries, including steel, automobiles, and electronics. Many American companies began outsourcing labor to foreign countries to remain competitive. The service industries are the most successful during this time period. Service industries include retail, wholesale, baking, public utilities, and entertainment. In Roe v. Wade, 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that state laws restricting abortion violated a woman's constitutional right to privacy. This led to the rise of the Christian right movement in the 1970s and 80s. The Christian right opposed abortion, equal rights, and gay rights. They supported traditional gender roles. They were also associated with evangelists like Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell, and Pat Robertson. The influence and campaign tactics of the Christian right delivered a critical proportion of votes to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Reagan won by a large majority, and immediately following his inauguration, Iranian terrorists released the American hostages after 444 days of captivity. Reagan believed in increasing defense spending, reductions in government spending and taxes, and traditional values like family, religion, hard work, and patriotism. He also believed in supply-side economics, which is where the government leaves more money to the people to spend. Reagan's goal was to balance the budget, so in 1981 he passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, which was the largest tax cut in history. He cut government spending for education, food stamps, public housing, and arts and humanities. In 1983, President Reagan proposed his Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, as an additional check on Soviet nuclear capability. The Reagan administration increased military spending by over 50% between 1981 and 1988. All this spending led to the worst recession since the Great Depression. The Cold War ended because neither country could afford the high costs. When Gorbachev became the Soviet leader in 1985, he loosened Soviet control of Eastern Europe. He also allowed some forms of free market commerce in the communist country. He also agrees to withdraw nuclear warheads from Europe. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the INF Treaty at the White House.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down.